All right, welcome everybody. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to settle in. Thank you for joining us today. We'll just give folks a couple more minutes to settle in. Great to see all of your faces. Thank you for joining us. Excellent, great. Well, happy Thursday. Good morning if you're joining us on the West Coast, and good afternoon or early morning, wherever you're coming from. Thanks for being with us. My name is Shadi Salehi. I'm the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, and I'm gonna kick us off today. First and foremost, I just wanted to give a little bit of Zoom orientation. Again, I know Zoom is kind of part of most of our daily lives now, but just a couple quick housekeeping items. If you hit gallery view, you can kind of see everybody's faces. Right now I'm sharing our screen. We'll be doing a little bit of screen sharing, jumping in and out of screen sharing throughout the next 90 minutes. So speaker view, if you really want to take a look at who's actually speaking, you should see that in the upper right corner. And then of course, throughout today's discussion, please feel free to use the chat function if you have any questions during the session. We're going to keep this as interactive as we can. I'll be keeping an eye out on the chat box. So if you have a question that comes up as someone's speaking, please share that question. It's probably a question that somebody else has as well. And if you really want to raise your hand, you can, or say something, you can also, I believe you should be able to raise your hand and do that. We'll keep an eye out for that. And if you still have questions or are having technical issues with Zoom, in the email confirmation you received, there should be a link that can answer all of those questions. But of course, we are here to help in any way. So if you have some technical questions, you can use the chat for that as well. I am thrilled to introduce this panel and session today. We have a range of wisdom coming from a number of foundations. We've also got Peak Grantmaking on the call to share more about some of their great work that they've done around addressing power and values and streamlining. And as you all know, as you may know, this is part of a multi-part webinar series that is a partnership of Philanthropy California and the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. Before I jump into all of that stuff, we know that we just want to acknowledge that this is not business as usual. We are all kind of uprooted from what our regular normal lives have been and have been defining a new normal. So before we jump into the content and the heady part of today, maybe we can just take a brief moment to do a little bit of breathing, kind of arrive and settle. So if you can get both of your feet on the ground, and close your eyes if that feels comfortable, but feel free to keep them open if that is more comfortable. And we'll do a little bit of breathing. So take a slow and steady breath in on the count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold it at the top. And then let it go. Let's do that again. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold it at the top. And exhale, let it out. Shake it out. How's everyone doing? Can we see it? Thumbs up, thumbs, middle thumbs, thumbs down. Great. See a lot of thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for that. All right, so here we are. So as I mentioned, this is a partnership with Philanthropy California, which is the alliance of Northern California grantmakers, Southern California grantmakers, and San Diego grantmakers. I want to give a shout out to all of our partners who have been part of promoting this effort, and a special shout out to Kate Seeley and the Northern California grantmakers team that have been producing the back end of all these sessions that we've done really seamlessly. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, the rest of the team there. And this is part of a monthly series where each month we're deep diving into the principles of trust-based philanthropy. Today's session is going to be about simplifying and streamlining paperwork, But as you'll hear in the stories today, a lot of the principles are interwoven. They don't necessarily stand on their own. When you practice one principle, it strengthens the other. So you'll hear examples of that, and I'll be pulling that out in our discussion today. The Trust-Based Philanthropy Project is a 5-year initiative. It's a peer-to-peer, funder-led advocacy and learning initiative. So as part of this effort, our work is about showcasing stories and examples of how trust-based practice shows up in different foundations. We believe it's important to show that it looks different for many different foundations, in hopes that you can hear a little bit of your own story in what you're hearing from others, and can recognize ways that you can make some shifts and adjustments to your practice to build more trust and relationships with your grantee partners. Ultimately, the vision of a trust-based approach is to recognize that there's inherent power imbalances that exist between funders and grantee partners, and that there are ways that we as funders can be proactive in alleviating some of those power imbalances in a way that actually helps strengthen grantee relationships and also helps make the work ultimately more joyful and more successful. And you'll hear examples of some of that today. This is our schedule. So we've already done a couple sessions. They have been recorded. So if you missed any of those, you're welcome to access those. NCG has a file of all of those. And today is simplifying and streamlining paperwork. We hope that you will kind of glean what you can from today's discussion. We'll be talking about some other elements of the practice and encourage you to join us for future sessions that are happening every month. And here are our lovely speakers today. I'm thrilled to be joined by Melissa Sines, Program and Knowledge Director of Peak Grantmaking. As many of you may know, Peak has been a leader in thinking through streamlining practices and also really looking at grantmaking practice overall with a values-based lens. We'll hear more from Melissa in just a bit. We've got Elaine Maumenee, Grants and Operations Manager at General Service Foundation, joined by her colleague Holly Bartling, Senior Program Officer at General Service Foundation in Berkeley. General Service Foundation has been actively streamlining and assessing practices over the last several years, and we'll hear some of their stories today. We've got Zaya Maumenee, Grant Manager at Headwaters Foundation in Montana, which actually kind of designed their grant management processes from the ground up. And we'll hear about how they've done that. And last but not least, Hani Hansen, Senior Program Officer at Compton Foundation in San Francisco, also having gone through a number of streamlining processes. So our hope is today that you'll actually get to hear some nuts and bolts of what does this look like, how long did it take, what had to be done, who had to be consulted, what were the kind of nitty-gritty questions that came up in the process. We'll hear a range of examples throughout the day. So trust-based philanthropy is really acknowledging that there's this kind of ecosystem in which we operate. It's a recognition that this is about identifying values. What are the values that drive your foundation, that drive your organization, and how can you align those values with the way you actually practice and the way you show up? Trust-based and trust building, of course, occurs on an individual level. So we've created this little graphic to kind of acknowledge, what is that ripple effect? When you build trust-based relationships among and between leaders and individuals, how does that support and build trust-based organizations? And how does that ultimately ripple out into the greater society? So it's kind of this idea that we know that if we can model trusting relationships, it can kind of be almost like a contagious thing that can build and grow and ultimately lead to a more harmonious society that we're all ultimately working toward. So we wanted to put this up front because this is about the values that drive it. Even though we are spending each month diving into the individual principles of a trust-based approach, it's always important to understand that it always begins with values. So be more than just looking at this as a checklist, it's actually an embodiment of values. So you'll hear a lot of examples of that today as people share how they even went about streamlining processes. Oftentimes, it starts with getting very, very clear on what your values are and what you stand for as an organization, and making sure there's internal alignment among staff and board prior to making any adjustments. So why streamlining? Why is this even a thing that we're talking about? How is it connected with a trust-based approach? Ultimately, the reality is many nonprofits are spending an exorbitant amount of time on application processes and reporting. There have been a range of studies that have been done, range of estimates about how much time an individual executive director or development director will spend on one single proposal. Some estimates can be upwards of 35 hours for one particular proposal. So it really varies, but ultimately it's this recognition that, you know, are we actually reviewing all the answers that people are submitting in these lengthy applications and reports? And really kind of recognizing that nonprofit leaders are stretched, especially in these times when there's a lot more variables being thrown at them than usual. And in prior to all this, there were already a lot of variables that nonprofits are dealing with. So part of it is recognizing and valuing the time that these nonprofit leaders have and need in order to do their work, and ultimately trying to think more intentionally about freeing up nonprofits to have more time to focus on the work at hand. And we'll hear examples of just kind of the rationale that drove some changes in 3 foundations. But that's enough from me. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Melissa Sines from Peak Grant Making, to share a little bit about Peak's kind of values thinking around why streamlining is even a thing. So I'll hand it off to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Shadi. So happy to be here with all of you today. I am so thrilled to be engaged with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. Some of the advisory board members 2 years ago at the Peak Conference in Orlando were on our main stage introducing this concept to our members. And so, you know, we've been following along with this as it's emerged, and so excited to be here to share a little bit with you about the work that we're doing that's aligned with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Peak Grant Making, we're a community of now, just this month, over 5,000 grant making professionals who focus on the how of grant making. That's really thinking through like the policies, the procedures, the processes that help funders outreach into their communities, accept and review applications, make decisions, monitor and evaluate grantees and their own portfolios. And then, you know, all of that you have to do to close out the grant and do evaluation. These processes are really core to who you are as a grant making organization. Many of you may know us or heard about us through our previous initiative, Project Streamline. This was definitely successful in opening up the conversation. But in the end, the time, as was mentioned, the time that went into that grantees were spending on applications reporting actually went up pretty significantly during the 10 years of Project Streamline. And so last year, as we've really been in conversation with our members about what's the holdup here, what's keeping folks from really embracing this idea of streamlining, we launched this new initiative with a broader goal, with really to help transform the practice of philanthropy into the practice of principled grant making. And so this is our white paper, Courage in Practice, the 5 principles for peak grant making. This, as I said, really began as a journey of discovery for our team through working groups, regional chapter events, surveys, and conversations with members and sector leaders. We listened and we learned. And so we've come to understand that, the aspirations and challenges that you have in implementing equitable, effective, and efficient grant-making practices is really about aligning those practices with your values. And through all of this work, we really heard loud and clear, it's not enough to simply know or understand what a grant making practice should be, right? Like, yeah, in principle, we can all say like, it would be great to streamline our, applications and our reports. But beyond that, we actually have to have the fortitude and the courage to live out those values and approach things like dynamics within our own organization and change management and organizational culture and those complex grant making systems to enact this change. So go to the next slide. And so whenever we talk about values, I think that, it helps for us to kind of start to think through, like, what does that actually mean, right? Because people use this term in different ways. So we say values, those are those moral constructs that are guiding people's perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors towards achieving goals, right? But there are definitely explicit values. So those are like those principles or core beliefs. They're typically developed by the organization's board and staff. They're often shared internally, externally on your websites, all of that, right? And then behind that, there's this idea of implicit values, these deeply ingrained principles that are guiding actions, but they're often neither stated nor even fully acknowledged. They often operate alongside those explicit values and may even contradict an organization's publicly stated values. And then there's those aspirational values, right? The things that we know that we should be doing. We appreciate them, we accept them as valid, even necessary for success, but they haven't actually been put into practice, right? And so they can align with those or contradict those implicit or explicit values. And so in this case, we're really talking about what are those explicit values that you're stating as a grant maker, and how can you ensure that you're living up to those? On the next slide, we did some research in 2018 around, what are the, kind of top values that foundations and other grant makers are holding. And we actually found there was a lot of commonality between all of the different kinds of grant makers, sizes of grant makers, around what are these values that are commonly held across the sector. That's not to say that every foundation has every single one of these values, but these did clearly emerge as like a place where we can find some consensus. One thing to note is that sometimes those values can be in conflict, right? So we may hold a value of, say, collaboration and partnership, and also hold a value of leadership, right? And so can you be both collaborative and in partnership with somebody while you're trying to lead them? And so that's why it's really important to get clear on those values as setting a stage for everything that you do in your organization, not just who you fund or what missions you're funding, but also how you're funding those everyday practices that grant seekers see when they interact with you. Then in the next slide, it just becomes so apparent that these grant making practices. Oh, go ahead to the next slide, sorry. These grant making practices are those things. It's really about the crafting your grant guidelines, your application forms, decision-making, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting, right? And so why is it so increasingly important to tie those values to practices? Because that's how the world sees your values in action. That's how they see how you are living out your values in real life, right? And so that's why I'm so excited to really jump into this conversation today with a group of grant making leaders who have really embraced this idea of starting with values and using that to inform their practice. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over, and like I said, love to hear from all of our panelists today. Thanks everyone. I'll see you at the end.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm sorry, I think I might have forgotten one of your slides. So
no worries, don't worry about it.
Thanks.
I kept rolling.
Yeah, thank you. And we felt that it was important to invite Melissa to kind of frame some of this alignment of how values and practice align. As you hear, peak grant making does a lot beyond thinking about the streamlining of processes, but the way that they really kind of think about and articulate the intersection of values and practice is really consistent with how we think about it at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, and wanted to kind of showcase some of that thinking. Hopefully it is valuable to all of you. And I wonder if any of these values show up for your foundations out there, because I'm already seeing a lot of parallels in terms of the values that we've popped out at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. So it's great to see. I love seeing this kind of assessment of what are the most commonly referred to values. And the big question is, does your practice reflect those values? So how does this all relate to streamlining paperwork? Ultimately, you know, we really want to think about how can we be more aware of whether or not these values are showing up in our paperwork processes. So much of what we do is about paperwork, and so much of what nonprofits do is about that as well. And so part of it is how can we kind of really dig into it so that it's giving us the information that we need, and so that it's giving nonprofits the space and time to focus on what works. So I want to start us off, among our panelists, start us off from hearing from the General Service Foundation. General Service Foundation over the last several years has been going through a deliberate process to re-examine all the practices of the foundation, really expressly with this same vision of what Melissa is talking about, to define values and align practice with values. So first I want to invite Holly Bartling from GSF. Can you share more, Holly, just generally about General Service Foundation's overall portfolio and why you all even began to re-examine your practices in order to kind of, like, what prompted all of that?
Sure, thank you, Shadi, and good morning to everyone. I'm just so happy to see this level of turnout for something that we're certainly very passionate about at GSF, and just really eager to be in dialogue with others. I feel like a lot of our practices have been influenced by our peers, including some folks on this call, and we really see this work as a journey, not a destination. So what I'll share is that in 2016, our foundation went through a process of working towards what we would call what our new North Star would be as a foundation. And we had 3 different programs that lived very in siloed ways: reproductive justice, economic justice, and a civic engagement program. And when our executive director came to the foundation, one of her big questions was whether we're a series of programs or whether we add up to something bigger. And we went through a process with our board to land on justice. And our board was very clear that justice for them was not just our grant making, but that it would be something that they wanted to see reflected in all aspects of our foundation. And I think Melissa's slides were really helpful, because I think what we also did was make justice an explicit North Star for our foundation. And it made a whole lot of things possible. So one of the things that it made possible for us in the fall of 2016, right after the election, was to just sit down and say, what are our grant making practices? And how can we think about time as a really important resource that we can give back to the field? So we literally took our entire grant making process with our whole team and put it up on a dry erase board with stickies. And we started circling what are the things that are legally required, what are the things that we feel are core, and then we just pulled off all the stickies and literally took away big parts of the bureaucracy of our grant making process. And in that, we chose to also set some defaults: default to general operating support, default to multi-year. These have been intentions or implicit, but we made them explicit. And I think the one big place for us was also just to reflect on what the purpose of our practices were and of our process. And we felt really strongly that the reports that we were getting didn't really actually teach us very much. And many of us had been grant seekers before, so we know the blood, sweat, and tears it takes to write a report. But the truth of the matter is you write the report for the funder you trust the least. So it doesn't often say very much. And we decided to do away with reports and shift to phone calls instead. And that one practice alone has really transformed our grant making. So I think overall what I would share as a headline is that this process of questioning what was a default philanthropic habit, and really asking what the purpose was and whether it was serving our value of justice, helped us to reimagine a lot of things, both on the kind of program side, but also, as I think Elaine will share, on the operations side.
Thank you, Holly. Yeah, I'd love to bring in Elaine, who can really speak to, she's kind of the lead architect in implementing a lot of these changes. So Elaine, can you share a bit about just kind of what were the challenges and considerations you had to think about, and what did the actual transition process look like?
Well, first off, hello everyone. I'm glad to be with you. Well, when in the beginning, we actually quite a while, I'm glad that Melissa brought up the Project Streamline, because we actually did that process back when it first was launched. And we actually took our grant system then pretty far in streamlining lots of paperwork and upgrading our system. But when I came on about a couple of years ago in 2016, the intention was that we were already going to plan to shift to a new grants management system. And I guess the challenge in there was that we already had like in our plans and in our plans for the years to shift. And after doing this visioning process with the board, making justice really clear, it actually helped drive our process and reimagining. So we did that process of like with the team, looking at every single step of our process and saying, stripping away and really only peeling back what we actually need and only asking for what we need. And really thinking about what were we doing in the default that didn't really serve our purpose or was more of a burden to grantees than necessary. So we did that. And as the processes, I was like looking for a new grants management system and then also beginning to select and implement, we did a lot of hard work. And every single step, every touch point we had with a grantee, what were the questions we've asked, really looking carefully at everything. And then eventually we went to the process of transitioning to the new system and migrating data, and that was a lot of work. Eventually, you know what, at the end of that process, we realized that the system that we were about to go into did not fulfill all the things that we wanted to. And there were some holes in it that we realized that we actually really didn't need. So we ended up quickly pivoting and staying in our current system. And we were amazed at how much, if we were to shift back to it, realize like our system was more nimble than we thought it was originally. It's just the mindset of what you brought into it. Like when I first started my job, like we're shifting, so I don't need to spend that much time in that system, but we eventually but all of that work that we did in the forefront with the team to like really peel everything back, really, I was quickly able to like shift and take everything that we have dreamed or thought of how we reimagined our processes and quickly pivot and apply that to the system. And that was really fast, and that took only a few months. But all that work really paid off. And it turned out to be a really good, and part of the process, the nuts and bolts of it, we actually did survey our colleagues in the field. We've heard like from colleagues in other foundations, like they're having really great practices. We sent out a survey and people responded, and we really learned from that. In addition, once we were in a beta test situation, we invited our grantees that we were close partners with to apply into this new system and gave us some really honest feedback about their experience. In the beginning process, one of our aspirational goals was to make it as easeful as possible for grantees, and even like so much joyful. I don't know if we actually got there, but that was kind of just a goal and a vision. And really, we had this really deep conversations with grantees. Of course, as they did the beta test, they weren't going to apply again. That served as their application. And we got really great feedback. And then also we implemented feedback points or touch points along the way that they can give us feedback at any point in the process. After they apply, they get an email saying, give us any anonymous feedback. They can go into our system at any point, click a link, and also give us feedback at any point during the process. And then also the fact that we got rid of reporting and having honest conversations with program officers, that was another place where any time the grantee can let us know how the whole process has gone. So that was kind of some of the things that we put in place. I think, our board was very, well aligned, and they actually, because they trusted the staff as much and, really trusted what we decided to do, we're really aligned and kind of appreciate all the work that we did getting that going.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Holly. Just kind of digging a little deeper on the board question, did you experience any pushback or even just kind of like a desire to hold on to some of the initial information that you used to ask for?
Actually, our board and staff are pretty well aligned, and we had our board trusts our staff tremendously, and we have gone through a process and for many years, maybe Holly can jump in as well, that we actually take a more view of the board at the strategy level of things, and we don't really kind of go into and review every single grant with them, but more on the programmatic level, give them a more of a strategy kind of view about the field when we do have our board meetings. Holly, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I would just share, I think, because we had a context for the changes, there wasn't as much of it all flowed. So once we set justice as the course that we were on, then we could explain that the reasons why we were paring back certain parts of our application process that were super bureaucratic was about creating a system that really centered our grantees. I'll also share, it took a lot less of our staff time because we decreased some of the bureaucracy. So there were benefits to our foundation as well. And I think that was also a selling point. But as we were making these changes, we were sharing them with our board. And I think, you know, in the case, for example, of shifting to the phone call, we learned so much more that we could share actually like the details of what we were learning in real time with our board in ways that it was very clear that it was making our grant making a lot better.
I love that. And it just really emphasizes, again, the importance of doing that work early on to really define what your values are, align the team around that. And then from there, like you said, it can kind of flow from there. It kind of, the trust flows from there, and it allows for these practices to be adjusted more quickly and more seamlessly. Another question for you, Holly, just wondering, you know, how have you seen your grantee relationships evolve as you have kind of transitioned to these new practices?
I mean, I'll speak very concretely about the shift from a report to a phone call. And I remember in the fall of 2016, the first time we did these phone calls, it was a lot of work when we first did them, but every single phone call would end with one of our grantees talking about how delightful it was and how joyful it was. And even though it was a really hard time, it gave us the possibility of being in much deeper relation with our grantees. And it helped us really see what people were struggling with. Our phone calls, we asked 3 very simple questions, but it opened up a pretty deep conversation, and it helped us be more responsive in real time to what was called for. And so I'll just give a very concrete example. One of the things that came out of these phone calls was a very deep sense of the high levels of stress, trauma, and burnout that our grantees were experiencing, and this is pre-pandemic. So we started talking on our team about that and what we could do, and we started giving unsolicited $5,000 grants to some of the grantees that were really like in the very close on the front line, whether it was dealing with family separation, at the border, or a whole host of questions that people were dealing with. We gave unsolicited grants and just wrote a letter saying, like, we see that your team has really been under a lot of stress, and we want to support you. Please use this for the health and well-being of your staff. And I think that we wouldn't know some of these things if we weren't in regular kind of deep conversation with our grantees.
Thank you, Holly. And thanks. I see Dimple Abichandani, Executive Director of General Service Foundation, is on the line and sharing the 3 questions that General Service Foundation asks grantees. Thank you, Dimple, for sharing that. Those are in the chat box, so I encourage you all to refer to them there.
I'd like to add like one more thing to our to the conversation about GSF. That this is like an iterative process. This process of refining and streamlining, it continues to evolve as we continue to work through the systems or work through our grants and we're hearing from the field. And one thing I'd love to share is or 2 things actually I'd like to share is that we've streamlined our award letter. It's only like 1 page. And we're happy also to share that after this webinar as a link to a template that we use. And we keep it really simple, and we want to convey that we really do trust grantees, and we don't want to have too many restrictions, and just strip away things that make it really clear and make it relational. Another thing we just recently changed in our process was that in our award letter, we decided to remove the grant terms from the award letter, and realizing that actually is a default within it served more of a purpose for us. So for our general operating support grants, to make a grant truly unrestricted is being able to remove the grant period from the grant award. And this allows grantees to use the funds to support their mission at any time. So it could be to move toward reserves, for example. That's a question we often ask in our, in our applications. But really, if you do have like an end date to the funds, then it doesn't allow them to use that to put that in their reserves. So that's what we've moved toward recently.
Thank you, Elaine. I think that also demonstrates that this is a constant refinement. Like Holly was saying before, this is a journey, not a checklist. It's about constantly reassessing. And I love that story where you realized even in your Streamline process, it was extra barriers in there that you didn't intend. So by getting rid of the grant term, that gives even more flexibility for grantee partners. Thank you both for sharing that story. And thank you for Dimple offering some extra context and information on General Service Foundation's practices. Please do keep an eye out for the follow-up email where we will include some of the materials that have been referenced. Next, I'd like to introduce, and of course, if you still have questions that come up, please do put them in the chat box. Thank you to Dimple for responding to a lot of those. And again, as speakers are speaking and you have more questions, please continue to put them there and we'll make sure to get them to our speakers. Next, I'd like to introduce Hani Hanson from the Compton Foundation based in San Francisco. And Compton Foundation also went through a significant streamlining process. And one thing that we didn't really dig into with the General Service Foundation examples was this notion of soliciting feedback. And Compton took a really intentional approach to soliciting feedback from grantee partners and informing those processes. And we heard a little bit about that in the General Service Foundation examples. So Hani, can you share, just give us a little bit of an introduction about Compton Foundation and what kind of prompted the shifts and how you went about making those changes to your practices?
Sure, of course. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much to the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project for hosting an NCG. So the Compton Foundation is a small private foundation. We've been around for about 75 years. And up until about 10 years ago, we actually had a very traditional grants process. Anyone could send in a full grant proposal, the staff would whittle it down, bring it to the board would whittle it down, money would go out the door, and then we would receive full reports back. About 8 or 9 years ago, our new ED came on board, and throughout her tenure, we've shifted those practices. We had already shifted those practices pretty intentionally. We moved to an inquiry and then invitation only process. So we would really only ask for proposals from folks we were fairly sure that we would fund already because we'd already done some digging. So we wouldn't be wasting their time. We moved to mostly unrestricted grants, started doing multi-year grants, and started accepting proposals and reports that were written for other funders and would even have other funders' names on them. So very real shifts, but still fairly incremental. Our most recent, what sparked our most recent sort of upheaval in our process is that last year our board voted to spend out the foundation's assets. So we're currently on a trajectory to close our doors within 7 years. And so this opened up an opportunity for us to really rethink how we do our work and to think about the values that we want to be holding in our relationships with our grantees. The decision to spend out was really a values-based decision. We fund work in climate change and reproductive justice and peace and progressive foreign policy and democracy reform. And our board had said, it's actually much more important that we move as much money as we can to these fields right now than it is for this institution to exist forever. So within that framework, it was actually a fairly easy conversation to have, to say, the work that we do needs to be about supporting people and not just sort of propping up our own institutional frameworks just because it's existed previously. So last summer, I did a number of things to help sort of get parameters for refreshing our process. First, we sent out a survey to a cross-section of our grantees to get feedback so they could tell us anonymously what was working and what wasn't in our grants process. That was actually incredibly useful because we sort of thought that the processes we had already were pretty simple and were pretty good. And on the most part, we got positive feedback, but like we heard, for example, that many of our grantees didn't actually believe us when we told them that they could submit proposals and reports they'd written for other funders, even though we said it 2 or 3 times in the materials, because we had a host of other questions in our own proposal form. They felt pressured to answer those questions and thought that maybe they would be penalized if they didn't. And we also found out that people were spending a lot more time on preparing proposals and reports for us than we had thought they were. And we really felt like we needed to give them back that time. The other thing that I did was I actually filled out a proposal and a report myself for my own work at the foundation. I created an account on our system, and it was an excellent exercise in empathy, actually. It had been a while since I worked at a nonprofit where we had to fundraise, so it was helpful to sort of be in that seat again, and was also really clarifying the questions that we thought were clear that actually weren't, or the places where our system was fairly clunky. So that was useful. So sort of with that data, and we grounded ourselves also in values, which were like never asking for anything that we didn't have a really clear purpose for. So never ask for anything that we didn't know why exactly we needed it. And try never to ask for anything that a partner doesn't actually have on hand already. So for example, now the default is that we ask for a proposal or report that they've written already for another funder. And we also will ask for their audit or a 990, whatever's most recent. So that way they don't have to create financials just for us. So from there, we developed sort of a simplified and streamlined system. I'll try to give a brief overview of what it looks like. Most of our grants budget is now, for the spend out, is tied up in 3- and 5-year unrestricted grants to anchor partners. So we receive one proposal that they've written for another funder. If they don't have one on hand, we ask them really simple questions. I think it's like, what do you want to do and why do you want to do it? And don't give them and we say in that prompt that we're flexible about the format and length of what they write. And then all reporting from here on out is actually in the form of phone calls. We borrowed from General Service Foundation. We were very inspired by them. So thanks to them for that work. And then for the rest of the years, every year, we just ask for that phone call and their financial statements so we can get an idea of what's going on with them and how we can best support. But that's it. For the new grants that we're making, we also moved to, we tried to simplify that process too. So again, only asking for proposals that they already have on hand, or if they don't have one, what do you want to do and why? And then some of those grants are to organizations that we don't actually know that well. So then we ask for their financials, maybe a little bit of background on the organization for our own context. But if we're moving, for example, a rapid response grant, we moved a lot of emergency funding to folks who are having cash flow issues or wanted to do rapid response around the pandemic. For those, we didn't even have them log into the system. I would upload their email request to the system and do all of that myself, and move move the money in that way. So we're 2 grant cycles into this new process. I already have some ideas about how we can streamline further, and we're planning another anonymous survey for this summer to solicit feedback on how this is going. We think it's going fairly well, but who knows? I will say that part of why we made this shift is, as has been spoken to already, wanting to give time back to our grant partners so that they can focus on what's actually the most important part of their job, which is doing the work that that's the reason why we're funding them. I'll also say that taking a different approach to paperwork and processes also sort of invites a transformation in the power dynamic that can exist between between a funder and a grantee. And there are ways in which streamlining these processes have made less work for me, and there are actually ways in which they've made more work for me. On these reporting phone calls, I take the notes, I put them in the back end. These rapid response grants, I'm the one doing everything in the database and all of that. But I actually feel like that's that is a benefit too, because I'm taking on work myself that is no longer on their plate, so they can focus on what they need to do, and I can really live into my role in this, which is just moving money as well as I can. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Hani. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think to your point, it also has helped you deepen those relationships and have deeper learning, similar to what we heard from Holly and Elaine at General Service Foundation. You mentioned that when you accept proposals written for other funders, you are looking at other available data like 990s or audit data that's available. There was a question about, do you do any other homework to basically add more depth or understanding about a particular or potential grantee in that kind of early phase?
Yeah, of course. So we try to do a fair amount of that homework before we invite anything from a potential grantee. If it's a new organization that we don't know before, or that we don't know if we just come across their work online or at a conference or something, we'll ask around and try to take on some of that due diligence for ourselves before we ask them for any of their time or resources. I think, and two, like we used to ask for references on all grant proposals, and now we ask for a handful of references if it's an entirely new organization that we haven't funded before, so that we can get a little bit more of a 360 perspective on sort of their work and how they fit into the landscape. So yeah, we do our own digging. I'm not saying that you should just push money out the door without really thinking about it. But I think the point is to take the burden off of your nonprofit grant partners and take it on yourself. So.
Thank you, Hani. And that actually really does, we've heard a few other trust-based principles coming up in these discussions. Doing the homework is one of those principles. And the last session we did was really focused on kind of examining what does that look like? What are some different ways that we can do the homework? So we'll encourage you to check out that recording, which I think Kate sent links out to some of the previous recordings. So you do have access to that, where we really dig into some of that. And we're also hearing a lot about soliciting feedback, which we do have a future webinar coming up on that as well. Thanks so much to Hani sharing the story of Compton. As you can probably hear, same emphasis on values alignment, same kind of focus on alleviating the burdens on nonprofits. And also that same theme of a new executive director coming in and kind of, shaking things up a little bit. Speaking of new executive directors shaking things up a bit, I'm happy to introduce Zaya Maumenee from the Headwaters Foundation in Montana, which had the tremendous task and joy of actually building up a brand new foundation with a brand new grants management system from the ground up. And so I'd like to introduce Zaya to just kind of share the story of Headwaters and kind of how you all approach this. And you come out of traditional philanthropy, so you had that lens and had the opportunity to kind of shake up that kind of traditional lens. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Zaya.
Thank you, Shadi, and thank you for having me on this call today. I really appreciate all of you and the lessons that you're bringing to this discussion. I am Zaya Maumenee, and I am the grants manager at Headwaters Foundation, and we are located in Western Montana. Shadi, I had some slides. I don't know if you had them queued up there.
Yes, I am doing that now.
Thank you. I just wanted to be able to share some of our some of the details of our process. But our funding region consists of the 15 westernmost counties in Montana, with the Salish and Kootenai tribes in the center of our region. And we're working to improve the lives of the children and families in Western Montana with a focus on American Indians and people in poverty. I had the good fortune, as Shadi mentioned, of being hired onto this incredible team just as the foundation was getting started in 2017. I was really excited for this new start with a new grants management system and an inspirational and playful CEO. Some of you might know Brenda Solorzano. She came to Western Montana from California. She had been involved in trust-based philanthropy since before she arrived, and she shared her vision with our board during the interview process for trust-based philanthropy, and they were sold right from the beginning. So I just want to share this slide right here on our circle of trust that we have embodied at Headwaters. The board trusting the CEO to trust the staff, to trust the community, and Headwaters believes that the community knows best. So the community is at the center of our work. In 2017, we met with all the communities in Western Montana and determined that what they needed. The board approved the approach, and then they allowed the community to determine our focus areas, our strategic initiative. They even decided that they would approve the buckets of funding upfront so that the staff could operationalize the funds and get them out as quickly as possible. So that really helped us with our streamlining. The best part about designing a system from scratch was that we got to simplify the process from the beginning with a lens of trust-based philanthropy. We took the approach of using the technology to build relationships instead of building walls. I was encouraged to be innovative and think about the user experience both internally and externally. I had been working in philanthropy for 5 years prior to Headwaters, so I had the experience of working with grantees and could understand what was clunky for them and for me. And the main takeaway from my previous job was that it took 6 months to get funds out to grantees, and that I really didn't want to have that same experience. I wanted to streamline the approach, and that became a real priority for our whole foundation. Most of our grants are invite only, similar to some of the other foundations. And we do all the work to build the relationships in the community to figure out who our funding partners will be. And in some cases, we even ask the community to pick an anchor organization to hold the funds for a group working in collaboration. We literally had them vote anonymously on an app. Some of these communities voted on an app to fund the specific organization who would hold the funds. It was interesting because it shook up what people had thought was who people thought was going to become the receiver of the funds, and really gave community their voice to choose who they wanted to hold that money for collaborations. And then we fill out the applications for them. We get the audited financials and the 990s, even without having to ask them to do anything. So this is for our invite only proposals. The key to our paperwork is simple and streamlined because it's essential to saving us time and getting the grantees the funds as quickly as possible. We use Smart Simple as our grants management system and have been able to customize our workflows to include one-click buttons that do a lot of functions, which is also part of our rapid response. So this slide shows our grant-making buckets that were approved by the board. And as I mentioned before, our board approved the buckets up front annually, so we don't have to go back to them for review of every grant application, which helps us, again, speed up our process. And as long as and I also mentioned that our applications are invite only, but we do have a program that's open and ongoing all year round, where anyone who qualifies based on the funding criteria can apply. And that is our Go Grants program you see here in red. The Go Grants program, Go stands for General Operating Funds. We actually stole that from, I think it was the Chicago Trust. We're all about replicating and duplicating. So we heard that name Go, and we just added an exclamation point to it to make it our own. The funding amounts for our Go Grants program are $5,000 per organization, and they go to our most rural communities with a focus on the most vulnerable populations. We figured our urban areas were very savvy at getting funding, and they were showing up at our door all the time, and we needed a way to spread the funding across all of Western Montana. And while everyone in Western Montana thinks that they're rural, we really wanted to make sure that the most rural locations got the funding. So we developed this as a rural funding program. And the funding amounts are $5,000, and then you can apply in less than an hour and get funds within a week. So when I was building the system, my CFO kept saying, make it as easy as applying for a credit card. And as I was building it, I saw some organizations who I knew would qualify based on having conversations with them, and I had them apply as testers, and they did get the funding, but I had them test our whole system. So they were able to give me feedback before we even fully went live, so that I could streamline even more and modify based on their feedback. And it took them less than an hour to apply that very first time. And then that really helped me clarify questions in our process. They were also very excited to be the first recipients of $5,000. But most of our first-time grantees to go into our Grow Grants program report back that it took about 45 minutes. And in the repeat funding cases, because they can apply again annually, it's taken them about 15 minutes to log in and click submit. So 45 minutes to apply for $5,000, and they can get a check in about a week. So the next slide, the key to the speed really was getting the board to approve things up front, and then also making the process as intuitive as possible. So this is the landing page on our website where you go to for Go Grants, and this is it. We don't have a webinar that you have to watch to apply. We don't have any downloading instructions. As I did work in traditional philanthropy before, I was very familiar with making webinars and videos on how to apply for grants. So I really wanted to avoid that. So we had this, basically, you fit these criteria, and then there is an eligibility quiz. And the next slide is our eligibility quiz. It's a little longer than this. I couldn't fit it all in, but it starts with just these kind of check boxes and radio button questions. Just a couple, doesn't take very long to fill out our eligibility quiz. And then the eligibility quiz saves them time because it gives immediate feedback on if they should even continue with the process. And then after they do the eligibility quiz, the next page is our registration page. And on the registration page, they can just put their EIN in, and then it auto-populates all of those fields. We do also have a database for schools because we fund schools. And so if they click that they're a school from the beginning, a different screen shows up and it gives them a database for schools, and it pulls all the schools, all of the schools in the United States, I think is what the database is. So this is how they register. And then the next slide is our login page. They log in, and then the next page is their portal page. So once they go into their portal, you have the next slide, Shadi. Thank you. So once they go into their portal, then the really key thing about this portal is that up in the left corner, you can see the organization profile. Because we're giving a lot of general operating funds, we really care about the organization profile and less about the details of the application. Because if people are mission aligned based on serving people in poverty or serving the American Indian communities that we're looking for, then they qualify for a lot of our different programs. And we didn't want to have them fill these same questions out every time, or have us fill the same questions out every time on application after application. So we just maintain a profile for them, and that way the actual application is really, really short. And the profile is not that long either, but it's great because it's just, you can update it once a year if you need to. Otherwise, like some of these grantees are in a lot of different programs, and it just keeps everything together. You can see the Go Grant opportunity is up there on the right, and they can click on that to apply for Go Grants. So because we have a lot of repeat grantees, then they don't have to go through the website and the eligibility quiz again. They can just go directly in here, click on that button. Now our Go Grant application is 5 questions, and 3 of them are radio buttons. And if you don't know the answer, we just say, make your best guess. So that's how we've been able to streamline this Go Grants process. The other piece, the next slide, is how we handle Go Grants internally. And this is called our Go Grant Scorecard. So the scorecard is what makes our internal process so fast. It takes different details from their organization profile and different pieces from their application, and it puts them really into this very quick visual. So our program associate or program officers are able to just look at this and go, oh, green, like, great, this is good to go. Or yellow, which means maybe you need to make a phone call. There's something that wasn't quite out of line, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to be funded. It just means that we need to have a conversation with them. And then obviously red is usually a no-go. Somehow they got in and answered the questions honestly, and something didn't align. And even in some cases with red, we'll call them and say, did you mean to click that by accident? Because it really seems like you serve people in poverty. Sometimes it just makes sense. And it's like, oh yeah, you do serve people in poverty. You just clicked the wrong thing. And then we'll call them and change it for them. So yeah, so our Go Grant, our scorecard has been a really awesome innovation for our team because it really speeds up our process. The other piece, the next slide, is we tried to make a lot of the buttons in our system one click. So it does multiple things. So this is our approval button, and the approval button, well, here's another cool thing. Our program associate is able to approve grants. They don't always have to go to our CEO. Because of the Go Grant scorecard, because the board has trusted the CEO and we've been able to operationalize that scorecard, we have a pretty clear picture of who's eligible and who's not. And so we can, our program associate's able to click approve, and then an email goes out right away stating that the grantee has been approved. That's what makes it go really fast. And then if it's something that she has a question on, she'll send it on to a program director or the CEO to help answer those questions. But the approve button is, it's great because it has, like it shows here, the payment process is created when you click it, the grant agreement is created, the email goes out to the grantee saying, please sign the grant agreement, the application summary is created, all these different functions happen from that one click button. But we are continuing to learn and grow, and we continue to streamline. And one of the things we've done recently is we developed a COVID-19 granting opportunity in response to this recent pandemic. And the board approved those buckets up front for food security and childcare and support for our past grantees. We filled out the application for those. We called the grantees ahead of time, made sure that they actually needed the funding, especially for the food banks. That was pretty essential. Most of them were really excited to hear from us. And then we filled out the application for them. And we adapted the General Service Foundation grant agreement, which thank you very much for having such a great grant agreement, that we just put into an email approval. And then that goes to them right away and says that if they cash the check that we send them, that basically they agree to the terms in the grant agreement. And it's really just unrestricted funding. So it doesn't have a lot of grant terms. It doesn't have any dates or anything like that, like they were mentioning. So they don't have to log in, they don't have to sign, we just mail them the check. So that COVID-19 process has really taught us a lot, and we want to apply that hopefully going forward to our other general operating funds.
Thank you so much, Zaya. I kind of wish we had, another hour to kind of dig into this. There were a lot of great questions coming up in the discussion. And one particular one, so there's one question that I think I'm going to reserve for you, Zaya, and then a bigger one around the difference between invitation only or open application processes. So Zaya, just a question around just your board, how are board meetings structured now, that if the board is not approving individual grants, what does that actually look like? How have you structured those board meetings, or how have they been structured?
So we call our board a learning board, and in every board meeting, we do some sort of learning opportunity. And they've learned about trust-based philanthropy. That was sort of all in the beginning. We bring in grantees to share and showcase their work. The board members also go to conferences with us. They've gone to GEO, they've gone to Grant Makers in Health. They like to, they stay really at the strategy level is where we try to keep them, and they really appreciate that, because they're busy and they're volunteer and they don't really want to spend a lot of time getting into the weeds. What's interesting about this is my first time with this kind of board, but when I worked in my previous job, we had a grant review committee on the board, and they always at the end of every committee meeting said, well, we'll defer to the staff because you guys know best anyway. And so it's fascinating to go from that to this type of board where really for them to go into the nitty gritty of every single grant agreement or grant application, they are just so thankful to stay out of that. So I think they really appreciate it.
Thank you, Zaya. And then there was another question, if you could answer quickly, when you were mentioning the community voting or via app for prospective grantees, how did you define community?
Well, so when Brenda first came to Western Montana, she went and did like 500 cups of coffee with everybody in Western Montana that she could get her hands on. And that included businesses, any kind of stakeholder, librarians, and people she thought might be in our nonprofit pool and people she thought might not be. She met with government and schools and all different kinds of people. And so she built this list of people across Western Montana, and then we just broke it out into regions, and then we would invite all of them again to this meeting, and then we would invite them to bring all their friends. So it didn't matter if they were retired, it didn't matter if they were a business owner. We wanted everybody in the community to be able to come and share in that conversation.
Wonderful, thank you, Zaya. So yeah, so a very comprehensive look at what every possible stakeholder in the community. Yeah. It's a really cool story and really cool process that I think Brenda shared on the multi-year unrestricted funding webinar that we did with Philanthropy California. So you can hear like the full details on that story and that recording. All right, well, we have about 20 minutes left. We want to reserve some time for questions. There were a number, I think actually 3 people asked questions about inviting our panelists to reflect on just the differences between invite only versus open application. What are the considerations there? How can you think about kind of the power imbalance that exists when it's invitation only? It's a very, very meaty question that could probably have its own dedicated webinar. But I would like to open that up to our panelists. Does anyone want to address this question? Holly, General Service Foundation.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and it's something that that honestly I feel like we still struggle with. So I can share kind of how our thinking has evolved in some of the experiments that we've tried. When I started at the foundation, we had an open LOI process, and it was actually kind of cumbersome to apply for to go through the LOI pathway. It took a lot of time. So one of the first things we played around with was making it simpler. And then we were getting so many LOIs, and part of what we were looking at is we would get a lot, but maybe out of it 1 or 2 would get funded. So that also didn't feel right in terms of the time it was requiring that people were putting in. So now we don't have an open LOI process. 2 places where we've experimented with having an open door was taking an idea from the legal field and doing intakes where we would set aside a certain number of staff hours every quarter and just have open 20-minute phone calls with people that were interested. And often as not, we would find maybe if we weren't a good fit for funding, we had ideas about others who could be a good fit for funding, so we could refer as well as consider groups that might be a possible group for funding. And one of the things that we did after trying that process for about a year was sit down and look at who actually made it like past the intake phone call to the next level. And almost every single one of the groups that kind of got funding ultimately had gotten to us by referral from one of our grantees. So like that process was very labor intensive. And often the referral itself to another foundation would require a whole bunch of extra work that was like really hard to keep doing with a staff of 4. So what I'll say now, the 2 things that we have been doing is both in our open phone calls with our grantees, we're super open to hearing them tell us who's doing good work that we need to know about, so that we're having an ecosystem approach to it, and then we can actively reach out to the group instead of just getting a lot of people coming at us that may or may not be a fit. And then the other thing I'll say is we're part of something called the Defending the Dream Fund, and we are running all of our grant proposals through the amalgamated Just Fund portal. And anyone that comes to that funding stream, which is a rapid response fund, can be seen by anyone on the platform. And right now, I think there's something like $10 million running through that platform. So it's a way for groups that are coming to us for a rapid response fund to also be seen by lots of other funders in both individual donors and foundations. And so some of the groups that have been coming through that pathway have been getting grants from other folks that are part of the network. So that's one place that's also been super helpful.
Thank you, Holly. Does anybody else want to comment on this question or how you kind of think about it at your foundation? That was pretty comprehensive, and it actually speaks to the doing the homework part, right? Where there's many different ways to do that homework.
I'll just add that we went through a very similar process, very similar to the General Service Foundation. We also used to have an open inquiry process that we eventually looked at the numbers and decided that it was actually sort of dishonest to keep it up because it wasn't reflective of how we were actually finding folks who were fitting in with our programmatic priorities. And we were also getting most of our new grantees through referrals from folks who we're already working with. But yeah, it's definitely something that I still struggle with. I think we as an institution still struggle with, and we try to be really careful to watch like whether and how our own biases and blind spots might be showing up in who and how we eventually invite folks to apply. So we just have to be really careful, but it's a hard question.
Thank you. I'm going to invite others to ask any more kind of questions for all of our panelists. We've got about 15 minutes left, and we want to reserve a little bit of time for some wrap up at the end, and we want to hear from Melissa Sines again to offer some kind of big picture reflections. But I am going to offer up a couple questions that do come up a lot when we're talking to others. And one is, all right, what about evaluating impact? How can you do that if you're having conversational reporting? What does that look like? Anyone want to take that one? I'm putting that in my best skeptic's voice. How do your foundations kind of think about or approach impact in this framework?
I can try to take this. So because we fund a lot of advocacy organizations, and in particular organizations that are trying to build movements and shift culture, those are things that are really, really hard to measure. So internally, what we try to do is think about it more as like learning and course correcting than straight up like evaluation or anything really quantitative. So that shows up in the kinds of conversations that we have with people. We're much more interested in learning from them, what they're learning and what they're grappling with in their work than we are in trying to get particular measures in the door. And I feel like those sorts of conversations and those sorts of questions help inform our own strategic thinking much more profoundly than any like particular, like how many people showed up to your event or how many people did you reach. I think in part that is just the nature of the kind of work that we fund, that's what makes more sense, but it also fits really well with our processes.
Thanks, Hani. I've also heard that same kind of sentiment reflected with GSF. Holly, did you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we also have a learning board that's just deeply curious about how change happens. And so I think the questions that we get are often around curiosity. But I will share, like there was a moment the summer that Kavanaugh got confirmed where we had a couple board members reach out to us to just say like, what is happening? Is our grant making strategy wrong? How do we understand this moment? And we got on a call with our board to talk about backlash and to talk about like this idea of very just sort of rational progress that happens incrementally isn't actually how change happens. And so how do we think about the moments that we're in? How do we think of the windows of opportunity? And then what is the role that our foundation can play in resourcing a group to seize an opportunity or to protect themselves against backlash? So I would say it's much more of an active conversation and dialogue that obviously starts with all of our phone calls with our grantees and gets brought into our board meeting discussions.
Thank you, Holly. That's such a great story and such a great example of how to kind of take advantage of the role of a learning board and kind of think collectively. So a couple super practical questions are coming up. One is, does reporting change depending on the amount of the grant? So if it's a small grant, are you looking at lighter reporting, or are those reporting processes uniform? I know we could probably spend a lot of time talking about this too, but do we have a volunteer that wants to share their response to this? Zaya?
I can share a little bit about our reporting process. It's really evolving. It started out as these brief final report, like radio button questions. Like, we didn't want them to spend a lot of time. We just wanted to get a few little details and, you know, be able to produce like a quick chart or a graph with it. It was really data driven, and we were trying to save them a lot of time. And we then hired an evaluation team to get involved with helping us develop a theory of change. And through the work with the evaluators, we had them do interviews with all of our grantees, asking them about what they wanted. And our grantees were like, we want to be in relationship. We want to have conversations. We don't want to log in and fill out anything. We just want to talk to you. And we already kind of knew that to some degree, because we had been doing some interviews and some site visits where we were filling out kind of questionnaires. But we took a whole different approach now, where we have developed kind of conversation tool where we can pull out themes that will give us connection to our theory of change to make sure that we're learning. I mean, ultimately it's for learning purposes, but we're still in a big evolving phase of the whole thing. So I don't have anything really concrete to report yet, but that's
It's a journey. It's a journey.
It's definitely a journey.
Thank you. Elaine?
Yeah, I would say like it does depend whether or not, so our reporting now is mostly all phone calls, but if it happens to be a project support grant, then we do require a financial report at the end of the grant period. That's for just legal reasons, legal compliance reasons, because it's a project support. But we do default, if it is a general support grant, we actually do not require a financial report at the end of the grant period. If it is a smaller, say we do have a number of trustee grants as well, and those the trustee grants, just a handful of those, they're smaller grants and we do not require any reporting. Those ones are our simplest grants. We just send out the award with no requirements. And Holly, do you want to add anything to that?
I think the only thing I would say quickly is that we're iterating as we go. So we used to require a phone call every year as part of a multi-year grant contract, and we got rid of that. So now the phone calls are not required except for at the end of the reporting period.
Got it. Thank you both. Another meaty question about how, if at all, have any of you modified internal financial controls or policies to align with these values-based grant-making practices? And I don't know if any of your CFOs are on the call. We might encourage anyone who has been part of that to speak up. But among our panelists, is anyone willing to address that question?
Does this question, I just want to clarify, is it about the endowment? Are we thinking about our investment side, or is it more about, I just wasn't clear what the question was.
Paula, this question came from Paula Kubias. If you can speak up and kind of add a little bit more context to your question, we welcome that. My guess is, have you had to have other financial considerations on how you're documenting your just kind of financial reporting if it's not as, detailed as it may have been?
So the grantee's finance, if it's on the grantee side, I mean, what a lot of people don't know, and what we actually learned from Project Streamline a long time ago, is you don't need a financial report if you have a general support grant. So a project support grant, which for us is usually, if an organization is fiscally sponsored, the only grant that you can give by definition is a project support grant. Those legally require a financial report. We do ask for previous year's financials on the front end as we are evaluating the renewal, but we figured that that's enough to know what we need to know whether an organization is in good financial health. And then we ask one other question about whether an organization has reserves or not. And we're very clear in that question the intent behind it, which is there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to know, like, how are you thinking about your financial health? And that actually gives us a lot of information about whether a group is planning whether they have reserves, and they can share information in that as well about potential future issues that they might not share in a budget, honestly.
Thank you, Holly. And thanks for pointing that out, that with a general support grant, detailed financials are not required by the IRS. So that's one easy thing that can be streamlined. That requirement is, I think a lot of times we might operate kind of assuming that those things are required, but in this case, it's definitely not. Okay, I invite you to ask any more questions, but we are going to kind of transition back to hearing from Melissa Sines at Peak Grantmaking to just offer some big picture reflections, maybe wrap up or kind of bring us back to some of the original kind of values framing, but also, Melissa, what are some kind of general takeaways that you see for our participants today? And I'm gonna pull your slides back up.
I was going to say there's no need to share the slides. They're just, I can just talk. So yeah, something that really, struck me as we were having this conversation was, it's really about making the connection between the operations side of the house and the program side of the house, right? Where you have the ability for folks who are, whether it's operations, finance, compliance, IT, grants management, to really have an impact on the way that you're doing your work. And bringing folks from the operations side of the table to these conversations about how and why you're streamlining your practices or implementing trust-based philanthropy or other values-based grant-making practices. It really helps to inform the conversations that you may be having at the board level or at the senior staff level, right? So that they bring, folks on the operations side really bring that practical component to, like, can this be implemented? How fast can it be, changed? And whether, like with the issue of like the grants management system, does the grants management system actually do what you think it should be able to do, right? Like that, these things are really closely tied together. And so it's really important to kind of elevate the operations side, the grants management side of the house, to a strategic component of the work that you are doing. And I think that, for us at Peak, we've been a home for grants management folks now for 10 plus years. And, we are really focused on giving people the resources that they need to approach these questions of values-based grant making or trust-based grant making in their own context, right? So you heard from three different people today with three different organizations today with three different approaches to how they, implemented the changes in their organizations and how they solved for the problems that they were seeing in their community. And so it is going to look very different for each of you. And so the resources that we have really over at Peak Grantmaking really help you think through those pieces and come to a conclusion that works for your organization and for your community. For me, something that I've really heard and recognized in our members, I've been at Peak now for 2 years, and just that ability and opportunity for folks on the operations side to feel that like mission alignment between what you say your values are and what you're doing in your grant making practice really increases their own kind of like personal satisfaction being on the job, right? That whenever you have that personal values alignment with what your organization is doing, you really lean into that work and you really, take advantage of all the opportunities that you have to be more mission focused, right? And so my encouragement for you is that like operations doesn't sit over here on the side as like, we'll just tell them what to do once we've decided everything that we're going to do, right? Like bringing operations and grants management folks into the center of these conversations about your values and about how they're showing up in your community is going to have better results, both for you and for your communities. So with that, I'll turn it back over. So great to be with you, all of you here today. Take care.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm going to just close us out with some key takeaways All right, play from current slide. Okay. So just a few themes of things that we heard today. It really pays off to spend that front end time building internal understanding around values and practice. That we cannot emphasize that enough. That is definitely one common thread across all the stories that we heard today. Streamlining paperwork saves time for everyone. It's not just for grantees, but as Hani pointed out, it can also create some more time, and it requires program officers to maybe spend a little bit more time to enter in notes into database systems. But ultimately, this is about saving time for grantee partners and can save you time in the long run. When you're streamlining, a question to ask yourself is really, how will we use this information? If you're asking questions, really take that time to think critically about how that information will be used to inform your decisions. And also, as we heard, you don't need to take a one-size-fits-all approach for your entire grant portfolio. It can look different for different grant programs. And as we saw in a number of examples, already streamlined processes can probably be even more streamlined. And we heard those examples with GSF realizing they could remove the grant term, or with Headwaters even further streamlining for COVID response. So there's always probably a little bit more streamlining that can be done. So what can you do now? Great suggestion. I think that was from Hani, to fill out your own grant application and ask yourself, how will we use this information? It's a really good process to see, and I've heard other funders who have streamlined make this recommendation to just actually go through your own application to see what that experience is like. We've got a bunch of trust-based philanthropy resources at our website here. Also, Melissa mentioned a number of great peak resources. They have an excellent action planner that's available to everyone. That's a good place to start, but among many other things, so check that out. We have this survey, and hopefully my colleague is on the line and can share the survey link, but you see the survey here, and it will also go out in the follow-up email. Please let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. We're going to be doing this monthly on other topics, so we want to incorporate your feedback. And finally, sign up for that next webinar coming up next month. And with that, I want to thank our fabulous speakers. Thank you, Elaine and Holly from General Service Foundation. Thank you, Hani from Compton Foundation. Thank you, Zaya from Headwaters Foundation. And thank you to Melissa from Peak Grant Making. And finally, last but not least, thank you to our fabulous partners at Philanthropy California. Thank you, Kate Seeley, for being the woman running everything behind the scenes at Northern California Grantmakers. Thank you to Southern California Grantmakers and San Diego Grantmakers for spreading the word and inviting all of your members and beyond to join us today. And with that, please stay tuned for the follow-up with all the good notes and things like that. And thank you for joining us, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.